Now, we'll move on to our keynote speaker here, Mr. Peter Grimm, a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy with experiences ranging from clandestine support for elite counterterrorism units to authoring intelligence featured on the President's Daily Brief. Peter has a unique blend of national security and strategy consulting experience. After his service in the government, Peter worked in the strategy practice of Deloitte Consulting before turning to a PE-backed competitive intelligence technology firm, which he led through 2 successful exits. Now, as managing director at Fahrenheit Advisors, Peter leverages his national security and corporate strategy experience to help clients better anticipate, prepare for, and capitalize on market and competitive disruption. He is a regular speaker at industry and competitive intelligence conferences around the world and is passionate about helping clients like Sherwin-Williams, Owens Corning, Google, Cover My Meds, Cvent, and Sodexo make smarter, faster decisions. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Mr. Peter Grimm.
Thanks very much, Bill. Appreciate it. Okay, can everybody hear me? Thank you all for having me. Thank you, Bill, for that lovely introduction. My name is Peter Grimm. I lead the strategy and operations practice at Fahrenheit, as Bill said. And today I want to talk to you about strategic early warning, okay? This is a methodology that was developed primarily in the Department of Defense, or the Department of War now, and the intelligence community where I spent the early parts of my career. And it's really helpful in the context of the discussion we've been having today. Just fascinating, great job with the morning. Can we get a quick hand for Bill? That was a really great morning session. So Bill told you all about me. We're going to skip that part. But I did want to start with this. This is Comfort Systems revenue and EBITDA over the past 4 or 5 years. Now, we've talked a lot about AI and the headwinds that has generated for you and sort of the historic opportunity that's been created. But I've been around for a minute. I've seen a lot of companies in a lot of different industries, and I can tell you with certainty that does not happen without absolutely exceptional execution. So I'd like you guys to give yourselves a hand really quick, because that is incredible. And the market has rewarded you guys pretty handsomely. And if you guys own Comfort System stocks, congratulations. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. You've clearly earned this reward. And it's even better today. I think this is a couple of days old. I mean, that's just generational wealth creation. And like I said, it's just a superb job. So I want to start there, okay? But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because your management team has asked some really important questions, and that's a very, very good sign for everybody in this room. I can tell you, I've been in situations around the world that books have been written about, movies have been made about. I can tell you that I have that sense being in this room with you guys. This is a historical set of events that's happening right now, and a historical track record of performance that you guys are putting together. But the question is, what would have to be true for this type of growth to continue, okay? And the way that I put that question, what would have to be true, is very important. We're going to get into why in just a minute here. So what would have to be true for the growth to continue? Maybe just as importantly, what signals could we potentially see that would tell us that our assumptions about the future are changing? We talked a lot this morning about all the different things and the unknowns and the things that we're banking on happening, things that we expect to happen, things that might happen. What could we see potentially that would signal us that our assumptions about that future might be wrong or might need to change? The time to build your early warning capability is when things are going well. In the military, we don't wait to start collecting intelligence until we're in contact with the enemy. We're making those preparations in peacetime. That is the best time to prepare your warning system, okay? Who knows who Dario Amodei is? Okay, Dario Amodei is one of the founders of Anthropic, one of the, often talked about AI companies. I say that because he's well known these days. He wrote an article just last month talking about, he called it the adolescence of technology. And it was sort of it was a diatribe, frankly. I mean, it's like 100 million pages long. But the TLDR version of it, and something that I thought was particularly insightful about it, was his predictions about how this whole data center build out is likely to go. And he draws on some historical parallels that have happened in our country and around the world over the past couple of centuries, really since the Industrial Revolution. And there have been a number of these huge historic transformational infrastructure build-outs that have happened over time, okay? So the first phase of these things tends to be that we undershoot in terms of infrastructure and capacity as demand is exploding and everybody starts to race to build infrastructure to support that new demand. That first phase we typically think of as undershooting demand. The next phase that's coming, and we can have a discussion today about, are we in this phase? Are we starting to get to this phase? When might this phase come? Is the overshoot phase, where inevitably in these situations, too much infrastructure will be built. It's almost a certainty to say that, okay? What's not certain today is when that will come, how much is too much, what does that look like? But it's almost a certainty to say that we are going to build too much at some point, okay? And that phase is very often followed by a consolidation phase where that excess capacity starts to unwind, okay? And sometimes those contractions can be pretty painful. Now, this is fact. This is going to happen in the AI data center build out and in all the associated infrastructure. I have no idea how long it takes. It could be another 5 years, just completely max capacity, pedal to the metal. It could be another 10. It could be next year. I have no perspective on that. You guys, the people in this room know that much better. But what I do know is a really helpful framework to help us think about what that might look like and harness all the knowledge that the people in this room have in a structured way to make some decisions about it, okay? So that's what I'm here for. Before we get into that, I want to talk about how human beings think and how we're taught to think, because this is really important when we start to talk about strategic problem solving, okay? If you think about problem solving, any problem, as a journey, okay, we're going to go on a journey on this little graph here. If you think about it starting in the bottom left-hand corner in a place we'll call complexity, okay? We got lots of variables. We don't really understand how they interact with one another. We don't have clarity on things. We know things are moving, but it's very complex. That's where we're going to start. Our goal here together is to get to the top right-hand corner. And I love this kind of rubric. I can't claim credit for this. This was put together by a guy named Fred Pollard, who was one of my mentors and kind of did my foundational strategy training at Deloitte. Brilliant guy. Go check out his website. But I digress. We're going to go from complexity to conviction. Now, there's basically 4 paths that we can take from complexity to conviction as we're solving a problem, okay? The first one is kind of the most basic, pretty linear, right? We call this the expert route. And why do we call it the expert route? Because when you are operating or trying to solve a problem and you're an expert at it, that means you've likely done it once or twice before, right? Hopefully lots of times. The classic example of this might be kind of IT consultants. So you hire SAP to come help you switch from, you hire Accenture to come help you switch from SAP to Oracle. In theory, that team from Accenture has done this transition lots of times before. They know what conviction looks like. It's a pretty linear path. You might have some little setbacks here and there and stage gates and so forth, but we kind of set out knowing where we're going. Everybody, make sense to everybody? Okay. Now the second path here is really kind of how we're all taught to think in school, okay? Certainly in grade school and up into secondary school, and certainly if you went to kind of a liberal arts 4-year program, there's a lot of this. And one thing I also want to point out on this chart before I go any further is that horizontal line. See that kind of horizontal line, the dashed line that kind of bifurcates this? Anything below that line, we're going to be talking about inputs to the process. So we're going to be collecting data, collecting insights, collecting information. Anything above that line, we're going to be talking about outputs. So we're making a decision, we're making a recommendation, we're making our presentation to the board or what have you. okay? Below that, inputs, above that, outputs. So the way we're all taught to think in school is we are taught to collect data. Second grade, you probably had to do a book report, right? What's the one kind of common thing that every kid gets chastised? You got to read the whole book before you do a book report, right? That's where it starts. Collect all of the data. And that becomes instinctual for us as we grow into adulthood and into our business lives. Our instinct is to collect as much data as we can, because instinctually we want to get to the bottom right-hand corner, which is certainty, okay? We get to certainty when we've collected enough data that we're certain there's not really any more data, so that must be the answer, right? We've got all the data. Aha, here it is, I found the answer. Now I can go up into the outputs and write my book report. Now I can, go up into the outputs and make my recommendation. Can anybody think of a profession? Please feel free. Love for this to be interactive. Can anybody think of a profession that still kind of tends to operate this way? Anybody? Legal. Sure, lawyers. Anybody else? Law enforcement? Well, I'm going to jumble that in with lawyers. Yeah, the law. But good point. No. And I'm going to get to that in just a second. The suggestion in the middle here was medical. And in some instances, that's probably true. Let me qualify that a little bit. But I'll tell you how I think medicine's taught to think. Over here? Sorry? The Fed. Yeah, sure. We're data dependent, right? Yeah, he says it all the time. Yeah, so really, my kind of joke here is that if you're in a profession that's paid by the hour, it's okay to think like this. Because guess what? It doesn't matter how many man hours or person hours or paralegals we have to hire or accounting junior staff we have to hire. We're going to get all that data, and somebody's going to pay us to get all that data. Make sense? Okay. Now, there's a third route here that's kind of the polar opposite of this. And we'll call this the creative route, okay? So we're all kind of taught to think along Route 2. We're going to talk now about the creative route. So if you think about the creative professions, let's say an architect, right? You go to an architect and say, I'd like you to design me a house. And the architect's going to spend a little bit of time collecting data, right, below that line. They're going to say, how big does the house need to be? Where is this house going to be? Tell me a little bit about your lifestyle and that sort of thing. What's the architect going to do next? Anybody been through this process? Spit out designs, generally multiple designs, right? They're going to come back to you with concepts. And they're going to go, which of these three, here's kind of a traditional one, here's a really modern, fancy one, and this is maybe a little bit different. Which of these feels right to you, right? That's kind of a very creative way of thinking. And what they're doing in that process is structuring really an infinitely complex problem with options, okay? They've created options around the problem. Everybody get that? Now we're kind of up in the outputs. We can refine and tweak and make the mudroom a little bit bigger and so on and so forth. But we're basically already up in the outputs of our problem-solving process. Real different than the way we're taught to think in school and the way that lawyers and accountants, maybe engineers might be taught to think. Now, as strategists, when we're trying to grapple with big questions like, what's the future of AI and how long does the data center build out last, and all these really complex, crunchy issues, I would argue that there's a fourth way that's the most effective to solve these kind of problems. And we call that the strategic route, okay? And really all it is a blend of the analytic route and the creative route. But it starts, you'll notice where it starts, it's a creative process at first, okay? When you go to the doctor, and I'm coming back to medicine here. When you go to the doctor, they collect a little bit of data, right? They'll collect your kind of medical history, did your mother have cancer and so forth, family history, take your vital signs, what's your temperature and how much do you weigh and all those sorts of things. They'll ask you, where does it hurt? What are the symptoms you're experiencing? So they've collected a little bit of data, but using their kind of deep experience and education, they can then structure that super, super complicated problem with some options. They'll go, well, based on the symptoms you've presented me with and your family history and so on and so forth, you likely have one of these 4 or 5 things, okay? What's the doctor do next? I think runs tests, thank you. So runs tests. So they're gonna go back down into the data. But when they do that, they're doing it in a much, much more targeted way. They're not going to collect every piece of data about you that they could. They're not going to run all the tests that they possibly could. They're not going to run, all the blood work and put you through an MRI and a CAT scan and all the things, because what they're trying to do is hone in on which of those options that they've already identified is the most likely diagnosis, right? That's called the differential diagnosis process. Very similar to how we're taught to think in the intelligence community. Very similar, it's probably the most effective way to think about big, really complicated strategic problems, okay? So let's move here. Before we get into the methodology itself, I just want to share a couple quick stories with you guys. In 2004, I was a lowly Navy lieutenant. I just finished my 2 sea tours. I was on a destroyer first and then had the privilege to be in a special boat unit, which, by the way, for my money, coolest job ever. Happy to tell you about it later. But I got to the Pentagon for my shore duty while I was going through grad school, and I was sort of randomly assigned to be one of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs Intelligence Briefers. So all of a sudden, this, I was under 30 at this point, had access to very top-level intelligence about what was happening in Iraq. And me, as a lowly Navy lieutenant, could see that things in Iraq were starting to go sideways in 2004. It was sort of common sense to somebody who wasn't steeped in this organization in the way that some of the more senior folks in the Pentagon had been. So I could see that, and the data was there. There's no question the data was there. But the narrative in the organization and the culture of the organization was about success. President Bush had just had his kind of famous mission accomplished moment where he landed on USS Abraham Lincoln and big banner said mission accomplished. And everybody, my age in the Pentagon was looking at each other like, you go tell them. Right? I mean, that's a real dynamic. That's a real dynamic. One other quick story. After, pardon me, out of the Navy now, I was working in the intelligence community, and I worked specifically on Iraq and the Sunni extremist groups that were operating there, kind of the worst part of that conflict. 2006, we had finally killed the founder of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, a guy named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, terrible guy. Finally found him and dropped the bomb on his head. Within about 3 months, there was a new leader that had announced himself as the new emir, the new leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. We in the intelligence community had no idea who he was. Never heard of him before, didn't match up any of the personas of the top kind of lieutenants that we did know about. No idea who this guy was. We had one audio recording of him announcing, I'm the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That's all we had. So I kind of put together a team and within a bunch of different agencies, and we did a statistical process called Bayesian updating, which I won't go into. It's a lot of math. But at any rate, we took the 10 most likely candidates that we thought might actually be this guy, and we ran sort of a statistical process to tell us who was the most likely of the 10 to be the guy who announced himself as the new leader. Okay. Fast forward to the fall of 2007, sorry. I was in Baghdad at that point, and the Special Operations Task Force rolled up this guy, who my team had said was likely the new leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Big deal. Big, very, very big deal, at least for us back then. So big that General McChrystal himself, who was running the Joint Special Operations Command at the time, sent not one but 2 helicopters to Baghdad to get me and bring me up to Balad to take part in the interrogation of this guy, because he wasn't admitting who he was. So, very long story short, we spent about 2 weeks and a lot of man hours with all sorts of elaborate ruses to try to trick this guy into admitting he was the new leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. This was my Jack Ryan moment, right? It doesn't get any better for an intel analyst. 2 weeks later, we were pretty sure it wasn't him. So very bad guy, great, really good thing that we took him off the streets, but not the guy we thought he was. So the reason I'm telling you these stories will hopefully become evident in just a second. Let's talk about indications and warnings. So this is the prime kind of framework that I want to talk to you guys about today. This was developed in the DoD largely in the 50s, right? If you think about right after World War II, we just bombed Japan. The Soviets now had nuclear weapons. The fear was that they were going to put a nuclear weapon on a missile and launch it at us, and we wouldn't know about it. Or we'd have very, very little short windows to react to it. This methodology was developed in part to help us get what we would call in DoD left of boom. And I'll show you what that means in a little bit. But really, it's to help us predict that the Soviets might be launching missiles, okay? If you've ever seen any of the Cold War movies, if you've seen Gene Hackman, the Russians are fueling their missiles. That comes from this, okay? There's kind of 4 steps. The first one is far and away the most important. So before you spend any time trying to do indications and warning, you have to understand what it is that matters. What are we concerned about? In the Cold War, it's pretty easy. We're worried about the Russians launching missiles at us. In the commercial world, it can get a lot more gray. And I'll show you an example, again, related to Iraq, where that was the case too. But that is crucial. If you don't get that part right, none of the rest of this matters, okay? So once we've defined what we're trying to protect against, or what we're trying to monitor for, what we're trying to anticipate, we're going to monitor those things systematically. We're going to ask ourselves questions like I asked you at the beginning here. What would have to be true in order for this thing we're concerned about to come to pass? And then of those things that would have to be true in order for this bad thing to happen, or even a good thing to happen, what of those could we potentially observe? And where could we potentially see that signal, okay? Then it's about sort of putting together a systematic way to monitor those signals. That's really what it boils down to, okay? And then the last piece of this, and again, very important, is to create some decision triggers, to decide ahead of time, before things are going sideways, what are we looking for, and when we see it, what are we going to do, okay? This is an example of a real indications and warning problem that I've worked on personally. For those of you old enough to remember this, when General Petraeus was put in charge of the Iraq War with the surge of troops, he was actually required to come back to Congress once a quarter and give a report. Otherwise, this would still be classified, probably. But he used this slide in a presentation to Congress. I'd like you guys to take a look at this for 15 seconds. Tell me how you think things were going in Iraq. This is the fall of 2006. Feel free. Not well. Anybody think it was going great? No. Okay. But what else do you notice here? So the color coding of the indicators is a key part of it. You want this to jump off the page in about 10 seconds. So they did that pretty well. Anybody see a huge problem with this, though? Huh? I heard something I think was pretty close to right over here. Subjective. Yes. What do we mean by subjective? Yeah, what does chaos mean? What are we concerned about? There was so much political sensitivity about using the words, is Iraq in a civil war? And how do you define that? They couldn't even get it onto the page. The White House wouldn't let us put it on the page, okay? So if you don't define what you're actually concerned about, you're gonna water down the entire value of all the thousands of man hours that went into something like this. Okay, because politically, we couldn't hear it. As an organization, we couldn't hear that it wasn't going the way we wanted it to go. All right. Now, this came out of DoD, right? But I've been using this methodology with clients in the business world for 20 years now. And that's because the domains that we look at for indicators in the national security world map really well to some of the domains that we would look for these indicators for in the business world, right? So when you think about capabilities in order of battle, To us in the intelligence community, that would mean, how many tanks does the bad guy have? How many subs do they have? Where are they located? What can they do? What are the range of the missiles? All those sorts of questions. For us in the business world, it maps really well to technology development. And that can take a whole variety of forms, but we'll talk more about that. We talk about the threat landscape and alliances, essentially the competitive landscape, who's partnering with whom, who's aligned with whom, who has shared interests. You can ask a lot of the same questions and get pretty insightful answers out of it. Political and diplomatic, almost identical, right? Who are the players, particularly in an industry like yours, with such a huge dependency upon regulatory bodies for the growth trajectory of this industry? This maps almost identically. And then the last thing is intentions and operational activity. So what are the bad guys doing? What do we think they're likely to do? What do they intend to do, okay? Within those, each of those domains will have certain indicators, okay? And so this is the process we would go through to think about, well, what are NVIDIA and AMD and the other semiconductor manufacturers doing around cooling research, for instance? We might think about things like academic attention. We'll talk about why that's so important, okay, when we talk about getting left to bang. The key thing to think about as we're thinking through these indicators is, are these signals accelerating? Are they converging? Or are they sort of just uncorrelated? Are they noise, right? That's kind of the art of this. There's a set of market structure indicators we could look at in terms of vertical integration. Are we seeing the hyperscalers try to bring more of the capabilities, more of the value creation that we deliver today? Are they trying to bring that in-house? I'm not saying any of these are the case. I'm just giving you some ideas of how I would think about this were we to try to break it down and really try to see what's happening. What new entrants are coming in, what's happening from a consolidation standpoint. Buyer concentration is a big one that I think in a lot of ways goes without saying based on the conversations this morning. I mean, I firmly believe that Dr. Basu is right, that the biggest risk here is if the hyperscalers or even one of the hyperscalers decides they're going to even slow down a little bit, that could start potentially kind of a waterfall effect or a domino effect. So what would cause them to do that? That's why we're talking about this. There's a set of regulatory and demand indicators too, right? So are we starting to see more pressure and competitive bids on pricing? Are we starting to see, changes in the way that environmental permitting is happening? We talked about how hungry these technologies are for power and water in particular. And I think we're already, arguably based on the conversation this morning, starting to see some changes in how localities and municipalities are thinking about permitting these things and what does that mean for us going forward. Critical exposures here, I think, I put water here, and you'll see why in a moment, but I would argue water and power probably are the two biggest exposures we'd be looking at. All right, why did I put water? Well, I wanted to talk to you guys about the Osborne effect. You guys remember about a month ago, the NVIDIA CEO got up at the Consumer Electronics show out on the West Coast and said, don't worry, the new Vera Rubin chips, we can cool them with 45 degrees Celsius water. They don't even need chillers. That morning, as I'm sure many of you are aware, a lot of cooling related stocks went off the cliff. Now they came back almost immediately once people figured out that this wasn't the end of the world. But this will not be the last time this happens in this industry. I think, again, Dr. Basu, I agree with him that a biggest risk is just kind of the investor uncertainty that underlies all of this spending. And it's starting to get a little shakier. And so every time you have a little wobble where somebody says something like this, it gets a little dicey, right? Now the Osborne effect, I don't think this is actually a direct example of it. It refers to, it's a Wall Street term that refers to the Osborne Computer Company in the 1980s. They came out and announced their new product line and how great it was, and immediately destroyed demand for all the products they already had on the market. They actually wound up going out of business. So it's really to refer to kind of a single announcement that can happen that fundamentally changes all of the assumptions that an entire industry is built on, okay? Now, again, I don't think this was, precisely an Osborne effect, but there's going to be more of this, I suspect, as we go. So how do we tell? How do we tell if this is the Osborne effect that's going to have to fundamentally change all of our assumptions about the way the industry works? Well, let's apply the framework that we just talked about, the indications and warning. So if we think about it from a technology standpoint, okay, so Vera Rubin is 100% liquid cooled. And arguably, and based on some conversations I had last night with some of your very knowledgeable colleagues, this is maybe even less of a big deal than even I perceived it as. But as somebody with, no real experience in this world, and certainly not the engineering know-how, using this framework, even I could pretty quickly tell you that this was not an Osborne effect. Okay, this is not going to fundamentally change things. And lots of people, smarter than me figured that out pretty quickly too, because look at what, the stock price came right back for most of these companies within a day or two. So when you look at this, all right, so we say it's 100% liquid cooled. Does that really change any of our fundamental assumptions about how we're going to create value? Well, not really. Not really. What'd the market do? Well, it did confirm, if nothing else, that there's going to be a premium on efficiency going forward, right? The market is sensitive to that now. We can take that as a concrete data point for sure. Regulatory often follows from this, right? Well, again, going back to the conversation this morning, people aren't quite so sure that they want something that's using millions of gallons a day of water on their water system. And you're starting to see some pushback in certain areas around that. And then demand. So this goes again to what are the hyperscalers doing about this? Clearly they're sensitive to it. And we talked about all the reasons that they are spending just incredible sums of capital to try to be the first to get to this finish line, if you can even define a finish line at this stage. But what are they likely to do in response to some of these dynamics around the regulatory pressures, the water and the power hunger that this technology has? Well, they're likely to try to innovate to deal with those concerns in some way. I can't tell you what that'll be, but it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody in the room that it was a big deal for Jensen Huang to come out and say, well, we don't need as much cooling or we don't need as much water, because they're very well aware that the world is getting sensitive to that. Okay. All right, so how do we respond to this? The next big step in this process, and we're going to work through some of this together in the afternoon when we get into our workshop, but it's really about kind of prioritization. So there's a lot of noise in the world today, and every time Jensen Huang opens his mouth, do we need to all kind of freak out and waste a bunch of man hours? How do we know? Maybe it is the end. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it'll be fine. How do we tell? How do we prioritize those things? So that's really what this methodology is really helpful for, is helping us understand when we need to just sort of watch something, because if it does happen, it's going to be a big deal, but we haven't seen it yet. What if we start to see some signals converging and we think something's becoming more likely and we maybe have a little bit more diagnosticity in terms of how far away it is in time? Well, maybe we start applying some resources to planning for that. What are the strategic options that we could deploy? What are the levers we could pull if and when this comes to pass, right? So you can be sort of monitoring, because it may never happen, but if it did, it'd be a big deal. Planning, now we're starting to actually apply. We're investing time and effort and resources in thinking about how we would respond, what we would do, what would the triggers be. And then the last one, obviously, is acting. And the key here is we want to understand what actions we're going to take based on what triggers well before those triggers happen. And that comes out of, again, okay, the missile's in the air, we got 10 minutes to make a decision. You don't want to have that conversation for the first time in that instance, right? You want to have a playbook that you've thought through ahead of time. And if we see these certain criteria, we go with response option B. That's what this framework is all about. So what are the strategic options that we have? Well, we could potentially, talk about defending. We could talk about innovating to solve a problem. There's a whole bunch of things that we could do when we get into planning. We talked about indications and monitoring. How do we do this? How do we watch all these things? I can't speak for EAS or for any of the other comfort systems companies at this point, but almost every company of any size that I've worked with over the years is already looking at a lot of this in one way or another. They've got lawyers looking at IP, they've got folks, maybe scientists in the R&D department are looking at some of the academic papers. Maybe there are folks, regulatory folks who are looking at water use, or you might have some government affairs people who are. The trick to this generally, in my experience, is knitting all of that together into a coherent picture. It's very rarely the case that a company has to go spend a bunch of money to go watch patents or spend a bunch more money to hire lobbyists to figure out what's going on the Hill. Most companies that I've worked with are already doing a lot of that. This is more about taking all of those inputs that we're already gathering and putting them into a coherent picture that we can actually make a decision about, okay? Now, when we talk about getting left of boom, this is kind of a counterterrorism phrase. If you think about the boom that we were all working really hard to prevent, it was pretty obvious, literally a boom, right? We wanted to get left of that boom on a timeline. So we would think about, okay, all the things that lead up to that boom, that attack, that bomb going off, whatever it might have been, what would have to happen? And in what order? What would have to happen for that bomb to go off? Well, it's got to be fused. They got to procure the materials. They got to have somebody that knows how to build a bomb. They got to get it to the right place. There's a whole bunch of things in a chain that have to happen before that bomb goes off, okay? It's the same thing in business, in most industries. I'll tell you who's really good at this is the pharmaceutical industry, largely because the product development process is so rigidly and well-defined. You have to do a phase 1 trial, then you have to do a phase 2, then you have to do a phase 3, and you can discover a lot of that. But this process can work really in any industry. So if we said, for instance, and I'm not saying that we should say this, but if we said together that, we think it's likely that the next generation of chips might not need to be cooled at all. I'm completely making that up, but let's just say we decided that that was something we were concerned about. Then we could start asking questions like, well, if that was the case, what would have had to have happened first? And how could we have seen that, right? So then you start having conversations about things like academic research papers and patent filing clusters and things that maybe we wouldn't think about in the context of a hyperscaler, but I promise those things are happening years before the customer is talking to you over the table about a change in the way they want to spec a project or pricing changes or anything like that. So if you want to get left of boom, there are ways to do that, but you have to ask yourself questions. First of all, you have to understand what you're concerned about. We have to define the problem, right? Albert Einstein famously said if he had 5 minutes to save the world, he would spend 4 minutes defining the problem and 1 minute solving it. Define the problem. Then ask yourself, collectively, what would have to happen and in what order for this thing we're concerned about to come to pass, okay? That's the crux of it. That's kind of the power of that. And that's what we're going to do when we get into the workshop this afternoon, okay? Now, what could that look like? What the outcomes of this process look like? I showed you what one of them looked like in DoD, right, with the Iraq example. A lot of the clients I do this work with nowadays, we produce something like this, or their internal team is producing something like this on an ongoing basis. Now, what do you notice about this? What can you take away in 15 seconds from this slide? Again, the all made up data. I'm not suggesting anything on here is actually true. This is just an example for format. But what do you take away from this slide in like 15 seconds?
No red.
There's no red? Good. What else? Anything else? It should jump right off the page at you. We're definitely in the planning phase, all right? So we're communicating immediately that we've been watching this for some period of time already, and we've taken an active decision to actually apply resources to planning for it, potentially, right? That should jump off at the page. Now, the other thing to know about this is not particularly helpful if this is the first time I've ever seen this. This is designed to be something that leadership teams or even within a sales team, you can look at these periodically. They're not a lot of work to put together, and start to think about what's changed since the last time we looked at this. How should our assumptions be changing in response to what we're seeing in the market? And that's really what it is. It's a framework to help you have that conversation in a really targeted and strategic way. Okay. Now, the deeper strategic question, I think, when it comes to the Jensen Huang announcement or statement, whatever you want to call it, is it's really a statement about the pace of structural change in this industry. Like we've established kind of all morning that things are changing fast, they continue to accelerate, and they're changing faster than they ever have, right? But if we were to ask ourselves a question like, well, if chip architectures are going to evolve every 18 to 24 months, which, again, there are people in the room that know a lot more about this, but let's just say they evolve every 18 months. What can we do in kind of harnessing the understanding of the value we create for customers? What can we do to stay ahead of that curve, or to at least maintain pace with that curve, if not get ahead of it? And I would argue that the I&W framework is really helpful. There's a bunch of other things we can do too, but this one is probably the easiest to get. So then when we start to talk about the options, what can we do in response to this, right? Well, we can start to talk about things like playing defense, playing offense, innovating a new solution. I had a great conversation last night with a couple folks around what I would call kind of customer intimacy, and I was really impressed by the way the folks I was speaking to articulated how you deal with customers. And we create value by knowing the customer really well, by understanding their business and how they create values, as well as they do, if not a little bit better, and kind of anticipating needs that the customer is going to have, maybe before the customer even knows they have a problem. That's really powerful when you execute that strategy well. It's called a customer intimacy strategy. It's not new, but it's very hard to do well, and I was really impressed when you guys talked about that. So there are ways, potentially, if you start to think about what does the world look like in 18, 24 months, maybe your customers aren't even that far out yet. Maybe there's an opportunity to innovate for a problem that they don't see yet, right? So I think it could be very powerful. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about disruption. Most of the work that I do with clients is not around I&W, indications and warnings. That tends to come after thinking through disruption, okay? And I talk a lot about how disruption happens in various industries, and there's a whole body of knowledge that you can get smart. We don't have time for it today, unfortunately, but there's a lot of work out there about how industries change and the patterns that we're likely to see. And that body of knowledge is much like a doctor going to med school and doing a residency and so forth. That experience and that expertise allows them to structure that super complicated problem with options. It's the same here. If you understand how industries change, and we'll talk about a little bit about some of the patterns here in a second, but if you really understand that, then you have that framework to put sort of pieces of what might look like disparate evidence into to help you understand what's happening in the industry and how it's likely to change. First part, so that's diagnosis. The next one is kind of assessing, so thinking about what are our competitive advantages, where might we have vulnerability. We talked about prioritizing, what am I just need to watch at the moment, because it may or may not ever happen, but if it did, boy, it'd be a big deal. What are we going to actively start planning against today? And what are we already taking action on, okay? Developing options and obviously execution, which, as I said, I've been around a lot of companies, and I can't say enough about what I've seen so far in terms of this group's ability to execute against a really good strategy. So, talk briefly about the 9 patterns of disruption, okay? This is based on a study that my colleagues at Deloitte did several years ago now, but it still holds remarkably well. They basically looked at 150-something case studies of industries that had been kind of flipped on their head over the last 30, 40 years, right? And there's quite a few of them to pick from. And they said, well, what are the commonalities that we could see? What are the patterns that we could maybe discern when an industry goes through a big disruptive change. And they came up with 9 of them. Now, most of the ones on the left tend to deal with kind of technological enablement. So if you think about Amazon connecting fragmented buyers and sellers in new ways, right? That was kind of their key innovation, taking a potential buyer in Minnesota and connecting them with a potential seller in Florida, right? In a way that had never been done before. When you think about connecting peers or distributing product development, that's really crowdsourcing, right? If you think about, anybody old enough to remember Encyclopedia Britannica? Yeah, okay. So Encyclopedia Britannica was made by a team of people probably this big who all probably had PhDs and worked on all those articles every year, right? Wikipedia took that and kind of flipped it on its head by distributing product development. They said, okay, anybody can add to this, right? GitHub, same thing. There's a million examples of it now. So that was, again, on the left-hand side, really about network effects. Now, on the right-hand side is where I would spend most of my time talking with a company like yours. And this is where you start to see things, particularly I work with a lot of kind of heavy industrial companies, manufacturers, construction companies, distributors, that sort of thing. The biggest thing we spend our time talking about is really shortening the value chain, okay? What does shortening the value chain mean? Well, in your industry right now, there's lots of people that touch the product or the good before it actually becomes a data center that's operating, right? You guys are a piece of that value chain and a really important one, but you're not the only piece of it, right? So from a hyperscaler standpoint, I promise they're having conversations about how do we take this super complicated value chain and try to simplify it. As a matter of fact, the gentleman for Oracle this morning made a comment about the pressure right now to try to remove steps. And he rightfully pointed out the pitfalls with that approach, but I promise that is happening at that level. When you start spending, 12, 13 figures, they're having conversations about that, I promise. Aligning price with use is always another really interesting one. So this is fundamentally the subscription model, okay? If you go back to, everybody thinks of software and SaaS and Salesforce, CRM, and all these things as being the guys who figured this out. It's really not true. This started in the 1960s with jet engines. Pratt & Whitney was the first people who did this, and it exists to this day because the economics make sense. But when Delta Airlines goes to Boeing and buys a new 737, let's say, okay, they're not buying the engines on that plane from Boeing. They're going to lease them from CRM or Pratt & Whitney or GE or one of the other manufacturers. And that manufacturer who made the engine is going to sell them or lease them that engine by the operating hour. It's called power by the hour. That's what they call it. So Delta is going to pay Pratt & Whitney a fixed fee for every hour that engine operates. Pratt & Whitney handles everything else, all the maintenance, all the overhauls, everything that goes alongside running that piece of very complicated equipment, and Delta pays them an hourly fee to use it. So that model's been around a long time, and I don't know whether it makes any sense in the context of EAS, but it is worth a conversation, I can assure you, because there are some really interesting things that will come out of that conversation. Okay. So those are the 9 parts, or the 9 patterns. And there's a lot more to that. Again, we just kind of don't have time to get into it today. So the hardest part here, I mentioned kind of the Pentagon in 2004. The methodology worked flawlessly. We had all the data we needed. We knew there was a problem brewing in Iraq. But the organization could not hear that message. Politics, personalities, however you want to describe it, the organization, no matter what we did at my level back then, the organization was not going to hear that message, okay? So the question to ask yourself is, if someone on our team, inside or outside of this room, sees a potential risk factor to the trajectory the business is on, would they feel comfortable bringing that to leadership? And I don't know you guys well enough to answer that question one way or the other, but I can tell you with certainty, it is a very, very important question, because somebody when things start to go sideways, somebody in the organization will see it. I promise. It's every disruption case study I've ever read, everybody I've ever talked to, Kodak, Blockbuster, you name it, all these famous companies that got upended. There were people in that company that knew what was happening and saw it coming, and the organization couldn't hear it. Okay, so if you take nothing else away from our work together today, please think about this. Because the answer really does determine whether it's even worth spending any time trying to do early morning. Because if you can't hear it, you're wasting time. Now, on time. Right now, you guys have the gift of time. You have the gift of time. You're growing incredibly, at incredibly rapid rates. You're profitable. Everybody, I know it feels like you guys are so busy executing, and I get it because you're doing such an amazing job executing, but you got to realize that you have time right now to think about what comes next in a real deliberate way that will pay dividends over the longer term. You have time. You have time to think before you have to act. There's nothing out there in the marketplace right now compelling a choice, compelling a decision, compelling an action. You have time to think right now. You have time to develop options. What will we do if and when, event A, B, or C happens? You have time to do that. You have time to align yourselves around those decisions and trigger points and where are we going to implement them and those types of questions. You have time to distinguish signal from noise. The last thing, I don't think this is the case with you guys based on some of the conversations I've had, but Jensen Huang comes out and makes this statement and everybody on Wall Street freaks out for 6 hours. I don't think you guys freaked out, but I can tell you that I've been around enough companies that can get wrapped around whatever the latest piece of news is and spend just incredible amounts of time. We did it in the Pentagon. Donald Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense when I worked in the Pentagon. Every time he saw an article in the Times or Fox or wherever he was, whatever it was, he was famous for sending out these things called snowflakes. And these snowflakes would be literally like one question, like, tell me more about this, or is this article true, or whatever. The number of man hours that got spent in a 30,000 person organization and just inside the Pentagon, and I mean, DOD's millions of people, the man hours that got spent routing these things and trying to figure out who knew the answer and who was authorized to answer this and who could speak for whom, just an enormous waste of time and effort getting wrapped around every little piece of news. So you have the time right now to set up a way to distinguish signal from noise. Okay. Now, the challenge I have for you guys, and look, I told you at the outset, I have been around few companies that have executed as superbly as you guys clearly have over the last few years, over the last 30 years, candidly. But the challenge right now is to think about, don't just celebrate. Yes, celebrate today's success. It deserves celebration. It's spectacular. But don't just do that, okay? You guys need to be asking the uncomfortable questions now. And I think you guys, everybody in the room, everybody in the organization should feel some measure of comfort that I'm even standing here today. They're much better speakers than me. I got nothing on Dr. Basu and the Rocky jokes. But the fact that I'm standing here should tell you that your leadership team is already kind of thinking this through and trying to figure out, what comes next after this historic run. And I encourage you guys all to be a part of that process, okay? So you can act before you have to, okay? Thank you guys very much. I'm happy to answer any questions now, but we are, I think, right after your speech, I think right after lunch, we're going to do a quick workshop together, and I'll break you guys into groups, and you get to kind of go hands-on. But any questions at the moment? Awesome. All right, can't wait for the workshop. Thank you very much, guys.